Will higher taxi fares convince more drivers to get behind the wheel again? For the past 6 months or so, the taxi shortage has been a common complaint among many people in South Korea. Even paying a premium to hail a cab has been to no avail during peak commute times and late hours. And the problem? Well, there's been an exodus of cabbies over the COVID-19 pandemic due to the lower demand and the growth of food delivery services that offered much higher earnings for drivers. Now, this has left many passengers stranded without options like carpooling or ride-sharing among non-taxi drivers, which were banned ironically because of fierce opposition from taxi drivers. Today we delve into this issue and discuss whether the plan announced by the government this week is likely to work. And for this, we're joined by Kim Yong-jin, Professor of Seogang Business School, and Won Hyuk-cho, Senior Lecturer at the Victoria University of Wellington. Very warm welcome to you both. It's lovely to see you both again. Well, beginning with you, Professor Kim. Now, the government this week, they announced a new plan to really address this taxi shortage. And what they plan to do is, well, from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m., which is regarded as the peak late night hour, taxi hailing fees on apps are going to increase from to 4,000 to 5,000 won from the current 3,000. And the destination is not going to be displayed for taxi drivers, so they can't just pick and choose their passengers. But do you think this will fundamentally resolve the problem of the really dwindling pool of taxi drivers?
Well, the policy Korean government recently suggests would be part of solution for the problem of taxi shortage in two ways. Firstly, tax fare increase will provide more, motivation for self-employed taxi drivers to work a little bit more in the later hours. And secondly, the cancellation of passenger destination will ease the bottleneck of assigning taxi to passenger call in the busiest hours. So the drivers cannot, select the passengers at their convenience. These two will provide more, taxi supply to passengers. However, it won't be a fundamental solution for the dwindling pool of taxi drivers and aging population of taxi drivers.
I see, and I remember you said before that this problem has been ongoing for quite some time. And well, turning to you, Professor Cho, now, the South Korean government, of course, as mentioned before, it plans to raise taxi rates during peak late night hours and also hike hailing rates on apps. And well, to what extent do you think this is going to help and help resolve this really severe taxi shortage that we're experiencing in the nation?
I think it would be useful to understand why taxi drivers left the industry and why they are still reluctant to return despite relaxed COVID restrictions and a rapid resurgence of demand for their services. During the pandemic, the COVID restrictions curtailed passenger demand for taxis as many office goers were working from home and borders were closed, resulting in fewer tourists. The average age of taxi drivers in South Korea is quite high, and many of them decided to pack up their taxi business and retire when the pandemic first hit. During lockdowns, many drivers couldn't afford to keep their vehicles and had their vehicles repossessed, which affected their ability to return to the industry. Taxi drivers who are younger and possibly working longer hours in late night shifts have left the industry for more profitable and less regulated sectors, such as delivery or retail, to seek more financially viable careers. Some drivers also fear being required to replace their cars with cleaner or greener but more expensive electric models to meet emission standards in the near future. As a result, the taxi industry is currently severely understaffed. Nearly a quarter of drivers left the industry during or after pandemic, according to the Taxi Association and Labor Ministry. One of the policy measures being discussed, as you said, is raising taxi rates or increasing surcharges to make them more profitable. To what extent will this help? Some recent experiments in Boston show that drivers actually respond sharply to changes in their hourly earnings. A 10% increase in hourly earnings causes drivers to drive about 12% more, according to the experiments in Boston. However, in South Korea, privately owned taxi drivers account for nearly 70% of the total number, and many of them are over 65 who may be prefer to work just enough to simply hit the earning target during the daytime. As for contracted corporate taxi drivers, the increased fee would not be directly translated into more earnings because many of them are working on their fixed monthly wages from 2020 with quite complicated trade union arrangements. So classical earning target behaviors in labor economics may make more sense in South Korea's context, and a fee hike would have only limited effects in making them available at nighttime or on rainy days, and you still may not find taxis when you need one most.
Well, that's exactly what we're seeing here, and I've had to make my way home on a public bicycle in the rain wearing a dress holding a handbag. So there you go. But it looks like the shifts that we're seeing in the industry, it's rather deeply rooted. They're deeply rooted shifts rather than a simple trend based on wages. And Professor Kim, now Korea's taxi industry, it has a system where the driver pays something like a usage fee for the company car and the taxi license that they share, and it's around 140,000 won a day. And if you're a self-employed taxi driver, like the ones that Professor Cho just mentioned, it's fine because you can really work by your own schedule. But if you're employed by a company, then you need to pay this rather big amount, no matter how many passengers you have. What do you think about this kind of system? Do you think it should be scrapped?
Well, I strongly believe that the what is called, daily lease payment for the car and the license, which corporate taxi drivers need to pay every day, should be abolished. It looks like a merit system, but it gives a lot of burden on corporate taxi drivers, which in turn makes both the working condition of taxi drivers and passenger ride experience really, really bad. So the monetary compensation need to change to a salary-based one, so that corporate taxi drivers would have some more stability in their income stream. In this way, they do not have to pick up passengers at their convenience and don't have to hurry up to go to the destination, which really make passenger experience bad.
I see. And well, more on this wage system for taxi drivers, Professor Cho. There's a fundamental problem. Many are seeing the root of the problem as the excessively low taxi rate here in South Korea, which has led to taxi drivers really hanging up their keys and turning to food delivery instead, as you said. So is South Korea's taxi fare mechanism quite unique compared to the rest of the world, and is it sustainable?
In general, South Korea's taxi fare mechanism is not too different or unique compared to other jurisdictions such as UK, Spain, Australia, and New Zealand. And South Korea did try to change the system, but as Professor Kim said, it's still quite problematic in some local governments, jurisdictions. But the taxi industry in South Korea is also heavily regulated, and taxi rates are way too low, as you said, which is why Korean government authorities consider pushing up the basic charge during nighttime to around $5, or increasing the initial fee for the first 2 kilometers applied during even the daytime, which is currently set at around $3 to as high as $4. Under traditional fare mechanism, many taxi drivers have been forced to pay enormous upfront sums for taxi permit, a license that allows a taxi to operate in the city, which is actually less about improving services, but rather about generating tax revenues for local governments. And drivers have often endured quite extreme price controls and limits on where they could go for customers. In return, taxi drivers used to enjoy monopoly status, with the government tightly regulating who else could enter the market, as we have seen in the Tada mobility platform case in 2020. The Transport Ministry in South Korea announced that the government would allow taxi hailing platforms to flexibly increase fares when operating at night. On top of that, I think they can include a reimbursement plan that returns the enormous upfront sums that the drivers paid for permits back to drivers, as most platform drivers, like Uber drivers, benefit from not having to pay that upfront for the right to drive. The upfront pay for the right to drive has had the effect of making taxi rides more expensive and less available than necessary.
And it looks like passengers these days, they need all the options out there really to overcome this taxi shortage. And they've been wanting these kind of new services like Tada, for instance, like Uber, for years and years. And well, the problem really that we're facing right now, the shortage of taxis, that's generated this strong sense of irony because Professor Kim, taxi drivers, as you may remember, they strongly protested against ride sharing, against carpooling services a couple years back. But now they're exiting the industry themselves. So what do you think really should have been done by the previous government, which gave out rather incompetent policies, as many saw it, giving into the pressure by the taxi industry?
Yes, as you mentioned, it is really ironic and sometimes sounds, absurd. I believe the previous government had to come up with a better solution or a better plan for the fundamental innovation of mobility industry, rather than just focusing on tech industries. The plan need to include ideas of, how to construct a productive relationship between the car sharing or car hailing industry and taxi industry, and also how to build a fair relationship between the mobility platform businesses and taxi drivers, and finally, how to bring competition into the mobility platform industry by lowering the entry barriers, to mobility industries. These things would make the mobility industry ecosystem more productive and efficient.
And that's actually something that you've been pushing for very strongly, for consumer choice, really. And well, Professor Cho, now, South Korea does have the tendency to block foreign services such as Uber from expanding in the Korean market initially. And well, how does this really compare with countries like New Zealand or other parts of the world where traditional taxi businesses, they've rather, well, with some initial reluctance, of course, adapted to new mobility services?
It is often easy to view these taxi drivers' resistance to ride-sharing platforms as a bunch of self-interested individuals trying to stop progress, while services like Uber seems to represent a modern fix for all the urban problems of congestion and lack of mobility. But it is still worth noting the driver's side of the story, because even Uber is causing huge labor issues in many countries, such as New Zealand. In New Zealand, Uber faces a major challenge to its business model at the moment, as drivers are arguing in the employment court of New Zealand that they are employees, not self-employed contractors. And New Zealand's two biggest private sector unions are involved in this court case. If the unions in this case are successful in their argument that Uber drivers are employees, Uber will be forced to pay the minimum wage, currently over $21 per hour in New Zealand. Also, holiday pay, sick pay, and parental leave, and Uber drivers will have to have the right to collectively bargain and have a legal recourse against unjustifiable dismissal. This court case in New Zealand is built on a growing body of international case law, the bulk of which has gone against Uber. For example, 2017 ruling of the European Court of Justice found Uber to be a transport service, not merely an information service, and that Uber exercised decisive influence over drivers, including setting fares and exercising the right to block them from the app. In 2020, one of the highest courts in France ruled that Uber is an employer. And last year, in 2021, the UK Supreme Court ruled that Uber drivers were workers under the country's labor law. Similar arguments were run. Uber set the fares and severely constrained drivers' ability to refuse rides. The UK court referred to Uber's passenger rating system as a method of control over drivers, which is a classic form of employment relationships. After the UK decision, Uber agreed to recognize the trade union for the first time. Most recently, a court in Uber's home country, Netherlands, found the same. So overall, South Korea's tendency to block foreign services like Uber is actually not necessarily against the global trend that appreciates drivers' rights and their well-being as the employees.
Right, so it looks like governments will have to take a more holistic view on this rather than just simply allowing or disallowing. But Professor Kim, just one more question before we go. Many do have to, we all do sympathise with the older self-employed taxi drivers, of course, as Professor Cho just said, because they paid a large amount of money to really purchase those taxi licences that they sort of hope to sell later, sort of like a retirement investment plan. So how might older taxi drivers then be quelled and also supported to keep their income level steady?
Yeah, basically it is true, and we have to be sympathized with them. Basically considering two facts. First one, the self-employed drivers in their 60s and 70s takes about 64% of total taxi drivers in Korea, and these drivers, income source would be only the driving, cars. So government need to support them. Especially if government brings a new system of mobility industry, like allowing Uber or Tada, or different types of car hailing and car sharing services, and so basically their licenses need to be repurchased by the government at a reasonable price. For example, they might be given pension commensurable to their income to a specific age, or they might be given lump sum money calculated with net present value of their license so that they can enjoy the rest of their life.
See, well, that does sound very reasonable indeed, and I believe that's something that some governments in Canada have been doing. And I'm afraid we're going to have to cut our interview here. That was Kim Yong-jin, Professor of Seogang Business School, and Won Hyuk-cho, Senior Lecturer at the Victoria University of Wellington. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.